All right, here we go. Back at it with the white vans, as they say. What's good, everybody? I am excited to kind of just present some information related to React and continue in this kind of this vibe of teaching JavaScript stuff. Hopefully that can kind of get you onboarded in a process of learning how to use JavaScript a little bit more productively. Last time we were talking a little bit more about JavaScript on a regular vanilla website, HTML, CSS, and JavaScript connected. We went through that kind of quick, I know, but really the biggest topics that we talked about that were really important to understand were the DOM, right? The document object model, which is an API that allows for JavaScript to interact with CSS as well as the standalone HTML file, which is called the document. And we learned that JavaScript is really powerful in what it's able to do for us in terms of creating functions that allow for us to interact with that HTML, right? We can create elements, we can interact with elements, we can delete elements. We learned that we could use JavaScript to interact with the attributes of different elements, so change things like the style or the text content inside of an element. And all in all, I hope what you got away from that was JavaScript is really powerful when it comes to its ability to interface with and interact with HTML and the content that we define from HTML. And so what happens in the web programming space is that we use those basics that JavaScript allows us to do using the document object model functions, and many different frameworks and libraries got created to make working with web-based in a web-based environment even easier. So things like jQuery, which some of y'all probably have heard of, things like React, which we're going to talk a lot about today. Those are like libraries that got created to extend the work of what JavaScript is already doing at a surface level. So all those functions, all those things we talked about last time are still part of these libraries. But what happens is the libraries do extra work to make it so that you as the engineer, the developer, don't have to do so much of the fine-grained document object model manipulation yourself. When it comes to something like React, even we'll talk about in a second, they've created an entirely new way of approaching how we make changes onto the DOM. And in doing so, that allows for like React and these other libraries that did something similar to work in a more optimized fashion, work more efficient, and in essence, work faster, right? So work smarter. So today we're gonna get into more of the React stuff. I really love the React stuff. So hopefully this, the purpose of this is to really get you onboarded to what React is. We're going to go through the React.js website and talk about, kind of the key points there, maybe look at some of the introductory code on the tutorials, and make sure that you kind of feel confident at least getting a project started with React using the command line. So we'll talk about that all today. So yeah, thank y'all so much for tuning in, and yeah, let's just get into it. So I'm going to pull up the first resource I'm going to pull up is really just the React.js website. So to start with that, the React website is definitely a great resource. If you're trying to learn React, you probably should take a look at the reactjs.org website. It is by far like kind of the most comprehensive spot for learning the React stuff, because that's where all the documentation related to React is located. So that's just reactjs.org. And when you go to the website, you'll come to this really dope landing page that is pretty simple, but very straightforward here for us in React. And it also, funny to know, is this website was written in React too. So just a little tidbit. So React, right? What is React? Well, React is a JavaScript library for building user interfaces. So let's break that down a little bit, right? We just kind of talked about what it meant for what being a JavaScript library means a little bit more, right? It's essentially a set of JavaScript code and and different functions that are written in order to perform some action, right? That's what we mean by a JavaScript library. This is JavaScript code at the end of the day that's doing something very special or unique. And specifically what React is very useful for is building out user interfaces. And so a user interface essentially is the forward-facing graphical content that and visual content that a user would see on any kind of in any kind of capacity, right? And user interfaces are on mobile, they're on the web, they're all over the place, right? They're the spaces in which the user kind of interacts with whatever it is that you are providing them, whether it's software or something else, right? So in this sense, when we say JavaScript library for building user interfaces, essentially React is a set of tools, functions, and code, JavaScript code that allows for you to more easily build out those spaces in which your user will be interacting. More specifically for us as web devs, it's helping us build out our web development interface, our forward-facing front-end interface. And couple things that you should know about React, right? It says here, React is declarative, component-based, and it says learn once, write anywhere. So I like to talk about it when it says declarative, right? That's getting into the way in which the language is written, right? Or the way in which, not necessarily the language, because the language we're using is JavaScript, but the way in which the library is written, right? React is a declarative library. And so you can create your code to be more predictable in terms of data that you're hoping to have at different points in time. This comes at declarative code versus what we normally call imperative code is essentially a big kind of topic in like normal computer, in like the computer science space, where declarative versus imperative programming, right? And the biggest difference between the two is in how the programming needs to be structured for the computer to understand what's going on. In a declarative, in declarative settings, you are able to describe more of what's going on inside of the code. Whereas in imperative coding, you have to be very explicit with, you have to be very explicit and kind of step-by-step procedural with the code, right? So let's see if this example here kind of can give us a better example of what that would mean, right? So let's just see. I know this is a little blurry, but on the left-hand side, we see an example of kind of like an imperative approach to adding to an array, right? So in this imperative style, you have to very specifically structure out what the array is. You have to very specifically say what type the new array is going to be. And then in this for loop, you have to have the specific count of the array and in order for this program to fully run, right? In a declarative setting, you can see in this case, the way in which this code is written, it is, it's kind of blurry. This is like probably not the best example because of how blurry it is. But in essence, how this declarative piece of code is being run, it doesn't have all of the information defined in front of it being run, right? So here it's calling modulo the $0 modulo 2. So that's what is kind of blurry here. But essentially, it's expecting for something to get passed into it over time, right? It doesn't necessarily have everything fully defined up front, right? In the imperative sense, you could say, hey, first do this, then do this, then do this, then do this. It's very instructional, right? Whereas declarative is a little bit more descriptive. Hey, I would ideally like for this array to filter whatever input I give it modulo 2, right? And in a declarative sense, this code can still be compiled and run and there'd be no problems, right? But in certain languages that are imperative, it won't allow you to write things that aren't defined, right? If something is not defined yet, it's kind of going to throw you an error. So when we talk about React being declarative, we're talking about the fact that React makes it simple for you to define your code in ways that can change over time. Rather than having to have everything structured at first, like having everything structured in front of any line of code, right? You don't have to have everything in a step-by-step like definition in order for the code to run. Rather, with React, you can kind of describe how you intend for your application to run and how you intend for the code to run. And React is smart enough to allow for that code to be compiled. And in doing so, it allows for some really cool complexity to be added to our work, which allows for us to set variables that might change over time and efficiently update as data comes back. So here it talks about React makes it painless to create interactive UIs, design simple views for each state in your application. And React will efficiently update and render just the right components when your data changes. Declarative views makes your code more predictable and easier to debug. And this is because you kind of are defining, here's ideally what I want my, how I want the code to look, or how I want the visual kind of interface that I'm building to look and to function, right? I want in one state of it to be like, to look like this. Like maybe there's a website you're building that's like a simple kind of web page where someone logs in and after logging in, they get presented with like a welcome screen, right? Well, if you think about it, you can have, there's a couple states of your application. There's the state in which the user's not logged in and they see some button that they have to click in to then log in. And then there's the, hey, you're logged in now, here's the welcome screen. With React, it makes it very simple to define, to describe those different states of your application. Like, hey, here's the moment in which my user is not logged in. Here's the moment when my user is logged in and what I would like to see. And you can very easily kind of describe how you want the interface to look in those different settings. And React makes it easy to manage those changes in a JavaScript-based sense very easily. This is opposed to, in an imperative style of coding, you wouldn't be able to define everything without having some of the context already there, right? If it just is a little bit more rigid in terms of what it needs in order to run effectively. React is a lot more flexible. It can process the changes that you expect to happen, even if you don't have all the data present at that time. So hopefully that makes sense. But I know declarative versus imperative programming is its own topic. Maybe we can spend some more time going into more examples of like declarative versus imperative code. But really, the best way to think about it is like in an imperative coding is very instruction based, like this, then this, then this. If I don't have step one, I can't do step two or step three. And imperative coding, declarative coding is a little bit more descriptive. It's about describing the ideal and ideally what the code should be doing, and then allowing for that to render and then things be changing at runtime. So hopefully that makes more sense. The biggest value proposition of React being written in this way is that it makes the code a little bit more predictable, because you can specify in your own way of thinking about it how you want the view or the user interface to kind of be perceived. Secondly, React is component based. And so we'll learn a lot more about what this word component means in the React context over time as we kind of keep diving into the docs. But essentially, like component based means that React separates the code into these smaller, what we call components. Each component you could think of like a little Lego block, right? And each Lego block stacks on top of each other to then create the bigger kind of interface that you're hoping to build. Every component is able to manage their own state, right? So like we talked about there in the application of there being like someone logging into a website, for instance, there's maybe the state of one component is whether something's logged in or not, right? And each component then would be able to keep track of that type of state, those types of data that's changing. The other day, we built out like a tic-tac-toe game for ourselves, right? And in the tic-tac-toe game, some of the data that we considered as state was things like the board, right? The board was changing over time, right? As well as the whose turn it was, right? It was changing a lot. And so you can think of state as reflected by the changes that are going to happen in the application. Each component that you build in React is able to manage that state. And so we'll see a lot of examples of that in a little bit. So since component logic is written in JavaScript instead of templates, you can easily pass data through your app and keep state out of the DOM. So part of what makes React really interesting is that you can, in separating our code into these different components, there becomes this way of us passing data just to from component to component, without having to necessarily change the actual HTML that is visual to the user. You can pass JavaScript data over to each component, which is just different functions running, right? And before you ever have to say, hey, add an element to this to the web page, right? You can very easily just keep passing JavaScript data. And then learn once and write anywhere is a big value prop of React, because at the end of the day, it's very helpful in terms of, one, it's very simple to kind of get started with. And when you do get started with it, you see it applied in a number of different contexts. React is a pretty widely popular programming framework. People are using it on all types of applications. There's a really dope Google Chrome extension that you can get that's called the React Developer Tools, which is this little floating React icon. I don't think it's going to show well on the let me maybe drag it over a little bit. This little floating React icon here at the top is the React Dev Tools, and the Dev Tools are will highlight at any time you're on a website that is using React. So it's really cool to see like other other sites that were built out in React, and I think that is a pretty cool tool for people who are trying to just kind of learn more about React. And of course, these dev tools do a lot more specific things, but in general, we'll get into those tools and what the tool does more specifically in later videos. But for right now, the idea though is that React is really widely popular. A lot of different websites use it. It also is very popular with mobile apps, with React Native being an extension of the React programming library that allows for you to build out mobile applications using React-based code. So for those of y'all who are interested in mobile and working on like mobile applications, React Native is a really cool extension of the React library that allows for you to define similar pieces of code, but in a mobile, in the terms of a mobile app, which I think is really dope and fascinating. So a lot of value propositions for why to use React. You know, one, it makes it very simple to describe how your application will look in different states, right? Which goes back to it being declarative. It makes it very simple to separate the logic of your application into what are called components. So you can break down a more complicated website into what we would consider smaller components. Everything about it is written in JavaScript, so you can pass the data through these things very simply. And then lastly, it's very popular. So there's one, a lot of community around it. There's a lot of support around it. And then two, it's been extended to be made helpful in relationship to other types of platforms like mobile applications and even desktop. I think there's some extensions for React that allow for you to build desktop applications as well. So cool. Those are some of the kind of key value propositions. And some of the next kind of big pieces here on the landing page of the React docs is talking more about like what it means by a component, right? So it says React components implement a render method that takes input data and returns what to display. And it says that those components use an XML-like syntax called JSX. Input data that is passed into the component can be accessed by render via this.props. It also says JSX is optional and not required to use React. you can also write raw JavaScript in order to do the things that React is doing. It just adds a layer of complexity to the code itself. So in general, I want to break down a little bit of what it means, what's going on here. And I know that sometimes when you're looking at the docs, you'll see a couple things that kind of are like, I guess, like a little gotcha, because at the end of the day, if you were working once you start a React project and you start looking at these classes and components, you might get confused because you see like things like this React DOM.render, what's going on there? You see this whole class thing, like what's going on there? I thought I was just writing a component, but yeah, so let's kind of break down a little bit of what's going on inside of this. So React components, as we mentioned, are kind of small blocks of code that you could think of like building blocks for your application. They would be the different pieces that would make up your final kind of web page. So if I'm looking at this particular web page, like the React web page, right? There's a couple different components that I might say are on this page. One might be this top level navigation bar that has the React icon, this docs, tutorial blog, community links, this little search bar, right? This whole bar itself, if you think about it like a big piece, could be said as a big piece of our application, right? Of our web page, let's say. That's the type of thing you would reflect as a component, right? A component is like a part of a larger kind of interface. Components are written in React with a very specific syntax. There's two ways to define components, but we're gonna talk about one way first and then the other way a little later on. So the first way to create a React component is to create what's called a class-based component. And so the syntax for that is this keyword class, which is slightly similar to like the classes that you might be used to working with regards to object-oriented programming. So this is this class is inheriting some logic from a base class, which is the React.component base class. Here's the name of the class or the component. Like we wouldn't call this thing a class anymore. Like if you see this kind of syntax, what you would call this is the component, right? So the component that we're creating is called hello message. The syntax we need to create this component called hello message is this class keyword, and this kind of extends React.component set of keywords as well. And then inside of the curly braces is really where the component declaration comes in, right? Every component needs to have a function called render. You just need to name it render, or else it's going to complain that the component doesn't have a render function. And the render function's job is to return to us what the component is supposed to show up on our web page. Now, they say that this syntax is very similar to XML. For those of y'all who aren't familiar with XML, it's another kind of syntax for describing information that's very similar in terms of it uses elements that look like this. But this is also very similar to HTML, for those of y'all who are familiar with HTML, right? I personally didn't know a lot of XML prior to learning React. I knew more HTML, right? And in knowing the HTML, I was like, oh wow, like this is very this syntax is super similar to HTML. One of the big things that you got to get out of the way first is that this is not HTML. Even though they're using a div here and closing the div there, like we were talking about the other day with HTML, this div that we're seeing here is a completely different type of element in the JavaScript sense. And we'll talk a little bit about that after we kind of start getting into some of the building out a React project ourselves. The big takeaway though is components have a very specific structure to them, and they render what they're supposed to show on the screen. Every component is responsible for rendering what it's supposed to show on the screen. In this case, this component is just creating a simple div that says hello Taylor on the end, right? We see also some stuff going on with this whole this.props.name thing. And then we also see kind of this React DOM.render thing that's going on. We're not going to talk about that right now, but trust me, we're going to get back to it in a little bit. The rest of the React.js website, though, goes into a lot of these information that you would need to know as you're kind of learning out React. So here they kind of talk about a stateful component, which, you know, is a topic related to what we were talking about earlier about the state of a website might change over time or over like data being processed. And so this is the example of like a timer like component, right? Where in a timer, you expect the number to go up every so often, right? So it's the state of the application is supposed to change every second. React makes it very simple to keep track of things like that that are going to be changing over time. We'll talk about that a little bit more as well. Yeah, so the website kind of just goes through more of the kind of key aspects of React that you need to know in order to write your components, render them, etc., use them for data and processing information and stuff. And we're going to go through all of these things over time. And yeah, so that's basically the main page of the docs, right? Just kind of getting you onboarded to what is a component. And so here we see another example of a component. It's called Markdown Editor. And we see that component describes a couple functions in addition to that render method. Remember, I said every component needs to return some JSX about what it's supposed to show. And the JSX is a very particular JavaScript language. So remember earlier I was saying, you know, even though this says div and h3 and label and stuff, which are very specifically HTML elements, in this JavaScript sense, this isn't actual HTML. This is a JavaScript element that was created to work like the HTML and in essence rendered the right HTML later. But the idea is that you can write this inside of a JavaScript file. If we go back to the main example that was here at the top with this hello message, here on the top, you can see this little button that says JSX. If you click it off, you can see that really all of the JSX that we were just looking at, that the JSX is this syntax that looks like kind of like HTML or XML, the tags and the closing tag, et cetera, et cetera. When you don't use JSX though, you can see that really all that is just some JavaScript functions being called. React has a function called create element. That element takes in the name of an element you're trying to create, some other properties, and it returns that, right? And JSX is hopefully making it more clearer by way of using these intrinsic elements that are built in from HTML. So all the HTML elements that you can think of have been built into the JSX syntax that you can use in this kind of approach that looks like very similar to HTML, but it's a completely different thing. So naturally, like my biggest thing when getting started with React, right, and getting started with anything, you always want to read the documentation, right? The documentation is always going to be your best friend in getting started and getting kind of just your big picture kind of things addressed, right? So today I want to kind of talk about what do you need to do to get prepared to like working with React in terms of installation, stuff like that. Getting a React project working, and then talking about some of the core files that we see in there and what's going on, and in general, right? And then I'll talk a little bit more about the website and like what the React.js website has, how I would kind of recommend you go through the docs on the React.js website, basically. So the first things first, let's kind of go through the documentation to learn about how do we get started with React and building out some interfaces using React. So if we continue to kind of go through the getting started guide on the main page in the docs, right? There's a couple different sections for trying out React, learning React, and other things, right? One thing that makes React really cool is that you don't need to create an entire new React project. If you have an old project that uses HTML, CSS, and JavaScript, you can add React to that project very easily wherever you need. Like essentially, you can say, hey, I want this part of my website to use React, and you can add that to an existing project, which is pretty cool. But you can also write React in online spaces. You know, a lot of different online text editors will allow you to, you know, write your code and run it and see how it's going. But you can also work on React on your own using your own text editor locally, which is essentially what we're going to do today. Like, we're going to use VS Code or whatever text editor you have on your computer to start a new React project on our own local computer. So yeah, the one of the after that, it kind of talks a little bit more about kind of how to learn React. And so it says that, hey, you can learn by doing this practical tutorial in React. We'll talk about that in a little bit. And they have some of the main concepts that are important to talk about as well, which we'll also talk about. As well. So yeah, there's a lot of different resources on the React documentation, but that's why I kind of recommend that people read through it, because there's just so much here that I would say is helpful in getting started, but you know, not a lot of people don't like to start with that process. So let's kind of go through the process of getting set up with React in general, and getting our first kind of React project up and running. So I'm gonna go to the whole creating a new React app setting on this on the installation side of getting started, right? And here you'll see that it's going to talk about something called an integrated tool chain. And an integrated tool chain is essentially just a very comprehensive package that allows for you to it performs some tools for you in order to get your project started. And there's a lot of different React tool chains. That's something that's really important to know when you're beginning. You'll hear a lot about different kind of platforms that people are working on, and like they're using different it sounds like they're using different frameworks. They might be talking about things like Next.js, or they might be talking about things like Gatsby, or they might be talking about all other types of some other types of things, right? But one thing you might not realize is that all of those things are still React tool chains. So you learning React is also allowing you to learn, you know, Next.js or Gatsby or any of these other kind of toolings that are being made to get you started with a new project. The idea, though, is that these tool chains, these integrated tool chains, help you with a couple things. They help you to set up your project so you're ready to like use different files and create different components. It sets you up with a node package manager package.json file so that it's easy for you to start getting ready with third-party libraries. Some of it already has like linting and error handling built in so that you can make sure that your code is efficiently running from the get-go. And a lot of them kind of create a server for you to look at your code while you're doing it in development. So remember last time when we were working on the HTML, CSS, and JavaScript stuff, I mentioned how working on your code on a server allows for you to kind of see as you edit what's going on versus having to reload and refresh so many times, right? Yeah, and then these tool chains also normally come with a set of scripts built into them that make it easy for you to go from development and testing to production, meaning having your code ready for more people to interact with and see. And yeah, a lot of the tool chains don't require a bunch of configuration. You just need to make sure you have them installed so that you can make use of them. And also, you know, simple enough to say is, just like I was saying before, you can add React to an old website in any website, really, just with regular JavaScript tags, right? So we talked about how in our tic-tac-toe game, for instance, we had to connect that JavaScript file to our tic-tac-toe game in order to basically have the HTML run the JavaScript. Well, similar to that, you can have a regular HTML website that then you use a script tag to define out, hey, I want you to use React, and that also is another way to get React running. But in this like program and in this like kind of set of classes and teaching you all this, I recommend using these tool chains. What happens over time though is that you start wanting to do more custom things that certain tool chains are better at than others. And that's when you start kind of weighing the pros and cons of different tool chains. But by far, the best tool chain for learning React and getting started with React is Create React App, which is a tool chain that you'll hear a lot about in reading about React and all types of stuff, because it is by far one of the easiest tool chains to get started with, and it does a lot of stuff out of the box for you. And yeah, all of those same solutions that it talked about here, Create React App does for you. It's by far a comprehensive tool chain that does everything that you would expect that you would need to have done. These other tool chains that you might hear about over time, things like Next.js or Gatsby, are clearly helpful in different ways and for different scenarios. Like here, it says if you're building a server rendered website, right, you can use Next.js. Or if you're building a static content oriented website, you could try Gatsby, right? And there's many other tool chains. You could create your own React tool chain. But learning and getting started, Create React App is definitely the way to go. And that's actually what we're gonna do together too. So Create React App is a great environment for learning React, and it's the best way to start building a new single page application in React. And when we talk about kind of single page applications, right? So one thing that's cool about the React.js website is it has this really dope glossary of terms. So if you're like kind of confused about any of these big terms, taking a look at the glossary makes a lot of sense. Single page application is really a very important concept when it comes to like what types of sites you're building out when you're using something like React. A single page application basically loads one HTML file, one HTML page, and everything else that happens via JavaScript behind the scenes. And this is kind of a different approach to building a website than what would be like a multi-page website, right? Which would require multiple HTML files that are linked together, and each of those HTML files have their own JavaScript, might have their own CSS, etc. Within React, one of the things that's very interesting about it is we normally are creating what are called single page applications, where we have one HTML file, and then any other behavior that we want to add to that can happen over JavaScript. Now, the thing is that just because an application is a single page application in terms of only loading one HTML page, that does not mean that that application can only have one page in terms of what the user can see. Like here in this React app that we're seeing, which is the main React site, is an example of a React project. Clearly, we're on a completely different page than the first page, right? You can still use JavaScript to do some very cool cool kind of complicated things around navigating a user and showing a user as if you're navigating through pages without this whole application needing that many HTML files, which is one of the things that React does to help optimize the process of working. So Create React App helps us build out a new single page application. And it also kind of creates a development environment for us that uses whatever versions of JavaScript we have available. And it uses Node so that we can also connect to all of the different Node modules that exist through the Node community. So the biggest kind of, if we're going to get started today talking about Create React App and getting started with it, the thing that we need to have installed first in order to work with Create React App is a version of Node. So if you are on the React.js website and you don't have Node installed on your computer, you're going to want to go to this this link that says Node greater than or equal to 14, and it'll take you to the Node.js website, right? And you can install the long-term supported latest version of Node, right? So currently that's 14.17.6. If you click this, it'll go through the download process of downloading Node on your machine. And once that installation finishes, you should be able to go into your terminal and or if you're not on a Mac, you can go on the command prompt on your Windows machine, right? And or the command line, right? And inside of there, you should be able to run a command. It's like node -- version, and it should come back with some version of Node that should be between 14 and I guess 16, right? So I'm at version 15, but that doesn't matter because the most recommended version right now is 14.17. So long as you have a version that is around this, you should be good. If your version is less than this, I would recommend re-downloading or upgrading your Node version. Otherwise, if you are between kind of 14 and 16, you're good to go. And the Create React App website says, yeah, we definitely need a Node version greater than 14 in order to run some of the different features that we're going to be talking about in a second. So take a second and download Node if you haven't done that yet, but for most of us, I think we already have. If you go on your machine and you do Node -- version and something comes back, that's a sign that you have Node installed. If you did this command and it said, hey, you know, unexpected keyword Node or something like that, that just means that you haven't done that step yet and you don't have Node installed on your computer. So you're going to have to go back through these installation steps that are here. Cool. So that's the only requirement you need for working with the Create React App toolchain. You just need Node installed. And with Node installed on your computer, you can then run a command that comes with Node, right? Node installs a couple things on your machine when you first install it. It installs Node itself. So like that's that Node -- version that we're seeing here. It also installs a package manager called npm, right? And npm is its own thing. And it also comes with another helpful tool called npx, which allows for, so npm helps you install packages. npx helps you execute certain packages that are inside of the Node package, inside of the Node kind of ecosystem. So npx is a specific keyword that now, because you've installed Node on your machine, your computer should know about npx. And that's why I'm saying you need to make sure you have Node installed on your computer. Otherwise, none of this stuff will work for you. But with that installed on your computer, then you can run this command, npx space create -- react -- app space, whatever you want the name of your new React application to be. And what this line does is it creates a folder. It runs that tool chain, and that tool chain creates a folder with this name. That name that becomes the name of the folder, right? So then you can change into that folder. And so this is the command to change directories in most command lines, right? So this is changing into the folder from the terminal. And then you can run the command npm start, which should start the actual React app and get it up and running. So let's just do that real quick, and I'll walk you through the steps as I do them. So I'm going to open up a new terminal, right? And so on my Mac, I kind of have the terminal already kind of in my dock. But if you don't have it already on your dock and you want to get quick access to your terminal, you can, the easiest way that I like to do, if I don't have it up and stuff, I could hold command, press the space bar to get the spotlight search, and just type terminal in here. And that will pull up the terminal application, and then you could just click enter, and then that should open up a new terminal for you. When the terminal app opens for you, if you don't have it saved on your dock and you're planning on doing a bunch of developer stuff, I would recommend that you save it to your dock. If you're on a Windows machine, you can do something very similar. If you hold the Windows key and then press E, and then type terminal or type command, you should see something come up for the command prompt. And then you can very easily open the command prompt, which is also, when we say terminal, we're talking about this command, this application on a Mac, is the command prompt on Windows. And so either way, whatever computer you're on, open up whatever your command line tool is. And if you don't know how to do it this way, you can also do it directly through VS Code. That's another way to do it, right? So I could just open a new VS Code window, and at the top of that window is the new terminal keyword, the new terminal kind of space. So I could just open a new terminal and then work with the VS Code terminal that will pop up at the bottom, right? So it's right there. Cool. So those are the various ways, right? So here in this terminal, I could work within this terminal. Those are the various ways that you could open the terminal. But either way, do whatever is convenient for you. For me, I'll just stick with my regular terminal. Once you're inside of the terminal, you're gonna want to navigate to a folder that you feel comfortable saving things in. So by default, no matter what, whenever you open a new terminal, it'll open up wherever your root directory is. And so on a Mac, this is a Unix-based machine. So that's why my thing has this like tilde and this percent thing right here. Your terminal does not need to have this, right? Your terminal is going to look completely different. But this is just indicating a new line of my terminal, right? The idea though is no matter what terminal you open, you're always going to be inside of your root folder. If you run the command pwd, you'll see what folder you're currently in, right? So this is my folder for my particular user on my computer. If I were to ls in this in this folder, which lists out all of the files in this current storage of this in terms of this particular folder, you can see a couple of different big folders are here. My downloads folder, desktop, documents. This is the root of my computer, my users folder in my computer. So typically I don't save stuff in this folder unless I really feel a need to. I created a new folder for myself in here that I save a lot of my computer related projects, like comp sci related projects and stuff in, stuff for work, stuff for like professional stuff. I kind of made a folder for that. Otherwise, you can also always just go to your desktop or go to your documents folder, anywhere that you feel comfortable saving code in, right? So for me, I feel the most comfortable always going into my folder that I created called comp. And I have a folder inside of there called temp, right? Where I just put temporary stuff that I might delete later. Again, you could go to your desktop. It doesn't matter where you go. You just want to make sure you're inside of a folder, right? You should do the pwd. You should make sure that you're inside of a folder that you feel comfortable running some code in, right? And building out a folder of some code in and stuff. And once you're in that particular folder, wherever it is for yourself, right? You can run this top command, npx create React app with the name of the app. So I'm just going to copy that first line and bring it into the terminal. So you should see npx create -react -app and then the name of whatever the app is that you're trying to build. After you got that in there, you can press enter and you should see a set of scripts start to run and start printing out onto your terminal. And if you didn't feel like you're a real programmer yet, you should start feeling like one now when you start seeing all this stuff moving and grooving and all types of output showing you some really interesting things are happening. And so let's talk about it as it's kind of working, right? I first ran this npx create React app command with the name my app. So it says, hey, we're going to create a new React app in this path. in that at that path for you. That's why it's important to be inside the folder you want to save the React app in, because it's going to create the React app directly inside of that folder for you. After it installs that, after it says that, right, it says, hey, okay, I'm installing some packages. This might take a couple minutes, and it definitely takes some time depending on your even your internet connection and all types of stuff. So first thing it does is it installs React, React-DOM, and React scripts with the create React app template. So these are just a couple libraries and packages that are useful for working with React, right? We always need the React package. We use the React DOM package as well. The React package uses this React-DOM package, and React scripts also is used when we're working with React projects. But one of the benefits of the Create React app toolchain is it does all of this stuff for us. It's installing those packages it needs, and then here you see it is resolving those packages. And so we're just waiting for it to continue to install and doing what it needs to do. And once it finishes installing all of those packages, so we'll let it wait for a bit, you'll see that it generates an entirely new folder for you with all of your kind of project, all the needs you need for like your project, right? So here we go. It finished installing a bunch of dependencies that it needed to install, right? Some of those are listed here. And then after it finished installing those dependencies, it initialized a Git repository. And we'll get back to this in a second. But that's pretty cool. It also initialized a Git repo for us. For those of y'all who know Git, that just saves you a step. And then it continues to do some more dependency management for us. And then finally, when everything is finished, it'll let us know and we'll be ready to go. And so one thing to know is that, well, I'll just wait till it finishes and then we'll see it together. Cool. So once your thing finishes, it creates a Git commit for you, which is really dope. And then it says success. It created this, whatever you name the app at this path. And it says inside that directory, you can run several commands. So this is the part that's going to look a little bit different on my computer than it's going to look on your computer. What you'll probably see is npm start, npm build, npm test, npm eject. That's completely fine. Mine is only saying yarn because I have an extra library installed on my computer, but it's completely fine that yours is using npm. There's no real difference that's relevant for y'all to know at this point in time. So if your thing says success and it says, hey, here you have some commands, npm start, npm build, npm test, npm eject, etc., and it says, hey, we suggest that you start going to your directory by saying cd into that directory and then using npm start, that's completely fine. Yarn is very similar to npm. It's a package manager, but it is a little bit more of it's a different package manager than npm, but it does very similar things. I installed it a long time ago, and so because it detects because it knows that I use yarn, forgot where it does it. Somewhere it says it detects that I'm using, yeah. Here it detected that I'm using yarn, and so it installs everything using yarn. But for y'all, because y'all are you have a fresh install of Node on your computer, you're probably using npm, which again is not a problem at all. So you should be good. Once that is finished, yeah, you'll see that you have these new commands to run. But in order to do that, you need to first go into the directory that you created. This is a huge thing that, you'd be surprised how many people forget to do that step. And then they're wondering, like, why is my React app not working? Nothing's working. You're not probably in the right folder, right? And you can see that you're in the right folder by running, again, this command line, command ls, which should list out all of the files inside of whatever whatever folder directory you're in, right? So in my temp folder, I have a couple different projects, right? But the one that I'm concerned with the most with is this one called My App. And so I'm going to CD into that folder. So CD is the command line command to change directories. So I'm going to CD into that particular folder. Because I don't want to see so much of this stuff. I'm going to just clear the terminal. So I just kind of clean it up a little bit. And if I ls inside of here, right? So now I'm inside of that folder that was created before. You see that this folder now has a couple of different files inside of it. Again, you're going to see something slightly different on yours because my package manager is Yarn. I see this thing called yarn.lock. On yours, you'll probably see something that says package-lock.json, which is completely fine. It's just they're just two different package managers, but they do very similar things. So you don't got to trip if you don't see it exactly 100% like you see mine. But cool. We just installed all of the things we need to start working with React, which is pretty dope. The next step is to run the React code. And so once you go into your directory, for y'all, you're gonna want to run a command that's called npm start. So you're gonna type this command, npm start, and you're gonna press enter, and your application should start. For me, because I'm using Yarn, I'm gonna just do yarn start. But trust me, it's doing the same thing. It's gonna start running some scripts. And then after those scripts run, we're gonna see, so you can see the steps are here, right? So we did this step, then we changed directories, and then we did npm start inside of that new folder. And after it does that, you're gonna see that your browser opens up a new tab for you, right? So in my terminal, it says now, hey, starting a development server, and then it should start up this new development server, which is going to open up a new tab in any browser that you have open. It's going to open a new tab to localhost :3000, which is essentially the development server for working with React. Clearly, I got a couple different applications going crazy, eating up my RAM, but here we are now. We see the spinning React logo. And if you see this spinning React logo, you know everything's good. You got your React app running. And congratulations, because that's a huge step in and of itself to have that piece of code running. And now that it's running, you can actually start doing some more cool stuff to manipulate the actual React code that's up there. So again, in order to do this, we made sure that we had Node installed on our computer. After we had Node installed, so long as you have Node installed, you should be able to run the npx create react app command. You always pass in the name of your project here. So whatever the project name is, you can pass there, and it'll create a new folder for you. So you don't have to create a folder for your project if you are using React. It'll create, if you're using the create react app toolchain, it will create a folder for you with that name. So that's just something important to remember. And after it creates that folder, then you can change into the folder, right? You have to get inside of the folder to work with it. And once you do that, then you can run some of the commands that are defined inside of this project, like start. Start is a script that we'll see in a second that's defined for us to run. And when we run this script, it does everything it needs to do in the background to launch a new server at localhost 3000 and put our React app up there. That's what makes a tool chain very cool, is all of that stuff just came out of the box. You know what I'm saying? You didn't have to do anything but make sure you had Node installed on your computer, which I think is pretty cool. And yeah, all of that gets you your first kind of React app up and running. And like I mentioned, it's a pretty big feat, because it kind of just is the beginning of y'all's journey, right? Working with this new library and doing some cool stuff in the web dev space. So definitely take a second to pat yourself on the back and congratulate yourself for getting started with a new programming library. And And yeah, after you do that, like I'll do that for myself real quick, you know what I'm saying? So celebrate myself real quick. And after you do that, you can hop right back to the terminal and you'll see that you have now like this local network that's up there for your React code, right? So you could go to any browser on your computer now and type in localhost colon 3000 and you should see that React site is up and running. And yeah, that's pretty cool. So next thing I want to do is talk, now that we got the app up, right? I want to kind of talk about, okay, well, as you can see, it says edit source src/app.js and save to reload. So let's do that. Let's edit the src app.js file and save and see what happens to this application. So first thing we're going to need to do is open up the files in something that is easy for us to use, right? So to start editing, right? So that's why we would need our text editor. So previously we talked a lot about VS Code and getting started with getting VS Code on our computer. And I mentioned to you that VS Code is my particularly favorite text editor right now. So I'm just gonna open VS Code. I'm gonna open a new window of VS Code. And y'all can do the same if you use VS Code, if you use Atom. It doesn't really matter what text editor you use, but personally, I use VS Code. And what you want to do is open the folder that we just created. So I'm going to open a new folder. And so I got to navigate to where I saved my folder. So navigate to wherever you saved your folder for your app. So wherever my app is located, and you should just click open to open up that new folder. And VS Code should reload, and you'll be able to see. So it asks you, they always do this security thing now for VS Code. So I'm just gonna say, I'm gonna just say, yes, I trust the authors because I'm the author, right? I don't need this welcome screen anymore. So I'm gonna just close this. And here on the left-hand side, we see we have this folder opened up that we created, the My App folder, and all of the different folders and files that got created inside of there. And so inside of there, you'll see a couple different folders and a couple different files. And today we're going to talk about what each of those files are for and what the folders are for, and make some changes. So first, let's do kind of like what this has suggested, which was edit source/app.js and save to reload, right? So source is this folder here, the src folder. If you open it, you'll see a couple different files inside of there. We see app.css. I'm sure you can maybe imagine what you think that's for. App.js, app.test.js, index.css, index.js. There's a logo.svg file in here. There's a report webvitals.js and a setup test.js files. And so these are just the basic files that get installed when we use the Create React App toolchain. The most important file inside, well, all of these files are important. Let me not diminish the importance of any of these files, but let's do what it said to do in our on our website, which was come to the source app.js and edit it. So when you click the app.js, you're going to see something interesting. You're going to see some JSX code. And this code is related to the code we were looking at the React website. The difference is that instead of defining this component, so what we're looking at here is a component called app. And this component is our main component. It's the first component that gets rendered in the normal React application. But here we see a couple of different things written out for this component. We see a div with the class name app, header with the class name app-header, image, paragraph, anchor with a link, right? And well, what is all of this? It's this literally everything that we see happening here. This is the paragraph text, right? This is the anchor, this Learn React. Here's the image. And all of the stuff that we're seeing here on our front end is related to the stuff that we're seeing inside of our VS Code, right? So here where it says edit source app.js and save to reload, we could very simply say something different. I'm gonna just say, hey, I'm getting good at React. And then if I save this, so my, so after you make this change, you're just gonna want to save it. My computer just taking a second, and now that it's done, so I saved this, right? If I go back to the website, I can see that this just quickly changed. So one of the beautiful things about React running this on a server, we can see all of those changes happening close to in real time, which is dope. Well, it doesn't really happen in real time. It happens every time we save, it hot reloads, and we can see it reload live, I should say. So React is cool because you can run your, the Create React App toolchain is cool because it allows us to start working really quickly in development, seeing all the changes that we make, and kind of get an understanding of, hey, how did this change work? How did that change work? Which is really dope. So the last things I wanted to kind of talk about are the various files that are inside of this folder, right? All of these other files, what are they doing? And we'll probably save some of that conversation for a later video, but because this one's kind of already getting a little long. But all of that we just did was set up our first React project. There's a couple more topics I want to just touch on briefly for you, those of y'all who are getting started with this for the first time, that are just some cool things to know. So we'll talk about these files, kind of what they're useful for in a brief sense. We'll definitely spend some more time reflecting on them later. And yeah, I'll talk to you about something else really cool about React, the Create React App toolchain that's important for you to know if you're a developer that is using Git and GitHub. So let's just dive into some of these files. So clearly we're looking at this app.js file first. This is an example of a component. This is a React component called app. Previously, I was telling you about how there were two ways of components being declared, but we only talked about one way, which was the class-based component way, which looked a little something like this, right? It looked like class app extends React dot component, and it looked like something like this. And inside of there, there was a function that I said we needed. Every class needed a function called render, and it looked kind of something like this, right? And this was more of the example of a component that we saw, was this class-based component. Class-based components are one way of defining components, but there's another way of defining components that's called a functional component. Right now, you don't need to know the difference between the two too much, but just know that they're the same. They're doing similar things in that they're defining a new component for us from React. So I'm gonna just go back to the functional component that was kind of pre-installed for us, so I don't kind of confuse y'all. Oops, getting good at React. I'm still getting good at React. So what we just saw was the class-based syntax. The functional syntax for a component is kind of simple. It just says function with the name of the function being the name of the component you're trying to create, and then inside of the function's curly braces, right, where you define a function, you have just one simple return statement that has the bit of code that we call JSX that you return for that you want to show on the screen, right? So this code here, like I said before, it looks so much like HTML, you might think it's HTML, but it's not. It's actually JSX, which is that React library syntax for JavaScript that allows for us to define the visual elements that we want to show on our web page. If you hover over any of these elements, right, you see this thing pop up that says JSX.intrinsic_elements dot whatever the name of the element is. This intrinsic element is basically saying that JSX has intrinsic, JSX has a number of elements already defined inside of it that you can use out of the box. Those elements are most of the HTML elements. So any native HTML element that you can think of, images, paragraphs, anchors, those are all, you're able to use those very easily in React, but they're not HTML. They're JavaScript elements. Written in this JSX syntax, it kind of might get confusing that, oh, like, aren't I just writing HTML here? Well, not necessarily, right? You're writing JavaScript that then turns into HTML in a very unique way. And this goes into some of the deeper things about how React works, which we'll talk about later. But for now, I just want you to understand what's kind of happening inside of all these files. This file also is importing the app.css. So I'm sure you can imagine what this file is doing. This app.css file is just a basic CSS file. And that CSS file is defining a couple different CSS rules for this for this default React app that's running here. Some of those rules are taking different classes. So remember, with CSS and VS Code, you can hover over the name of the selector and you can see what kind of element it's referring to. So clearly this is looking for an element with the class of app. So in our app.js, we see this div element has this class of app. In JSX, you know, you're looking at JSX instead of HTML because you see things like this. Technically in HTML, this attribute would be called class, right? But in JSX, it's called class name, right? Because this is JavaScript. It is not really HTML yet. It's going to turn into HTML, but it's not HTML yet. We're still working with JavaScript. How do we know we're working with JavaScript? Well, this is a .js file, right? This isn't a .html file. We're only working with JavaScript in here. We're using the function keyword. We're using imports. Like, that only happens in JavaScript, right? So components are declared with this syntax. They can either be class-based or functional, which we'll see more of what the difference is between those in a bit in future videos. But after each component is responsible for defining what visually it's supposed to show for the application, right? That's the component's job, is to define out the little visual elements that it's supposed to show. Then you export the component, and then you can bring that component into different, into other JavaScript files. And so we'll see that in a second. But also with components, you can connect them to style sheets very easily. So if you want to style the elements inside of a component, you can give those elements different class names that you want to use. And inside of a CSS file that you import, you can connect those components to their own little styles that you want to have. So that's how you would connect the JavaScript React component to corresponding kind of CSS styling. So that's the first kind of two files that we see, right? The app CSS and the app.js. The app.test.js is a very simple starter file for writing tests on your React code. So a test is essentially a bit of code that runs to validate whether some code is running properly. So they create an example test for you in React so that you can kind of see how would you write tests if you were trying to write more tests on your code. So in this case, this is writing a test that checks whether or not the application renders a link that says learn React, right? And so this test is doing that. It's rendering the app, it imports the app from the app, it renders the app, and then does some testing logic to test whether or not something is inside of the document, right? I'm not going to go in too deep into this right now, but we will talk about tests in the future. But I guess one thing that's important to see is that you can import the components that you've been building into these different JavaScript files, right? So here we're importing that same app from app.js that we defined and then exported here, right? We're able to then import it elsewhere because it's a JavaScript item, right? So that's what the app.test.js is doing. The index.css, this is a very specific CSS file for another JavaScript file called our index.javascript. So we'll talk a little bit about that in a second and what it's doing, but this is just another CSS file. The index.js is a very important file, if not probably the most important file actually inside of this folder. The index.js file is the file that connects our React code to an HTML document. So remember before when we were reading about React on the website, it was saying, oh, you can use React anywhere. You could even add it to regular HTML, right? And it was showing you on the React, I really want to show you this. So I'm going to go back to the React.js website. Let me just go back to the main page. So remember when we were like toward the bottom here, it was showing us an example of a component, right? So here they're using the class-based syntax. We just saw the functional syntax. There's no real big difference, but they created a component here. But remember how I was saying like all these examples have this weird thing at the bottom, like React DOM.render, and inside of the parentheses, there's like some interesting stuff going on in there. We didn't really talk too much about what this thing is, but everywhere on the docs, you'll see this thing floating underneath the examples. No, you don't need to have this thing in all of your files, right? This is a very specific function that's telling React to render this particular component onto the into the browser. So they're using this as an example because they're rendering it into this little space here on the right. But normally we wouldn't render the component directly like this, especially if we're using like the Create React App toolchain. Like if we went to the app.js, you'll see there's none of that inside of here. We don't ever see anything that says like, hey, you know, render DOM something, 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 right? Well, all of that actually happens inside this index.js file. The index.js file is very interesting in that it imports React and imports React DOM, which are two of the packages that the Create React App toolchain installed for us. It imports that index.css file to just make sure that this has access to those particular styles. And then it imports that app component that we just created, that we have created for us, right? And it imports like this report web vitals function that's very kind of like a function that's just used for measuring performance in your app. It's not necessarily super necessary. You could delete it if you wanted to, but that's what this is doing. But what this file is responsible for is this function React DOM.render that is creating a set of React components to render on our HTML document. It's using the most important thing for you to see here is it's taking that app that app component that we created, and it's rendering that app component into our document. But this line right here should look very familiar if you were around or like you were looking at the last video we made talking about JavaScript connected to HTML and CSS. This line is a document object model function. This is a JavaScript function that is used to connect to our HTML file, right? And connect and manipulate the document, the HTML document. This whole thing, what this is doing is taking whatever component it is that we're trying to render, and it runs this function document get element by ID to find where in the HTML document do you want us to insert this component for you. We're going to talk a whole lot more about that in a second, but the idea here is that this line is saying, hey, you know, we're going to take this HTML file that you gave us and we're going to insert this component that you created in React into that HTML file. And in what this function does, this React DOM.render function, broken down, it takes all of this code from this component, right, that looks like HTML. Remember, I told you it looks like HTML, but really it's JSX intrinsic elements or whatnot. And it takes all those intrinsic elements, and this function actually does some of the work of turning it into regular HTML to be rendered on our actual HTML file. Now you might be wondering, well, where is the HTML file? There's no HTML file here. Like, what's going on, right? That is inside of this public folder. Inside of the public folder are a couple different things that were installed with Create React App. One is this favicon, which is the icon that normally shows up on the browser when you are looking at a new website. So if you're a web dev working on a new website and you want this little icon, that thing is called a favicon. And you can add that into this public folder for your website. But here we also see the index.html, which is a very simple HTML file, right? Remember last time we talked about how HTML files have very similar structures. They all kind of start off with this doc type HTML. They have this HTML tag that opens up, right? And inside of this HTML tag, right? Remember, if we hover over it, it says, this represents the root of an HTML document. And this is where the document object model functions allow us to work on. Inside of that HTML file, we see a couple other HTML tags. We see the head and the body. The head is where you define all of the metadata for your application, right? So that would be stuff like all of these meta tags, the character set, things like we're going to link to the favicon. So this is the linking to our favicon. Stuff like the viewport scale and like in it, so like how zoomed in is the page when it first loads. And just some different things. Like here's some stuff for like social SEO, a little bit, description. This website was created using Create React App, as well as some other just like metadata, right? So these are just metadata for the app. And then we see here the title for our application, React app or whatever. So the head just has a couple things for metadata purposes in there. But the body, right? We all remember the body as the space in which we define all of the elements that would show up on a that would show up in our server, right? Like, or on our HTML, excuse me. In opening the body, what you'll see is, okay, there's one tag that's a no script tag. It's an element that just basically says, hey, if JavaScript's not running, we're just going to show this message to the user, and we're going to say, hey, you need to enable JavaScript to run this app. React requires that the browser that you're looking at has JavaScript, otherwise it won't work. But then if you scroll on this body, you don't see anything but this div with this ID root. There's literally nothing in here, right? That's it. And it says here, this HTML file is a template. If you open it directly in the browser, you will see an empty page, right? You can add some stuff here into the to the HTML file, but it says the build step will place the bundle scripts into the body tag, right? So to begin development, you can say npm start or yarn start, and that will run the code that we were just talking about inside of this index.js file, right? That will take this component that we want to return, and this component is going to be put into the document, this index.html document, right? It's going to insert it inside of this root, this div called root, right? And that's kind of just what's going on with this React DOM.render thing. It's rendering our component inside of our actual HTML document. So you only need to see, you're only going to use this, if you're using Create React App, you're only going to see this once. And this goes to the idea of the single page application. We have one HTML file, and what React is doing is inserting our component into that HTML file with this React DOM render. And then we never really do this React DOM render stuff over and over again. We just end up changing the data inside of our app component to be a little bit more, to do more specific things, which we'll talk about over the course of the next couple of weeks. To just finish up, the other files inside of here, we have the logo.svg, which you can't really see. It's just it's the file that represents the image that is inside of our React app. So this like spinning icon is a SVG file, right? So that's what that SVG file is. This report web vitals function is a function that does some stuff for performance. When you start measuring performance and things like that, you don't got to worry about it too much right now. And in setup test is a JavaScript file built out for you for when you run your testing, when you do your app.test.js and stuff like that. This file gets run first. Other than that, we see some other files inside of here that are important to know about. It create React apps and creates a README for us, which is just a description of what's kind of going on inside of these folders and like some of the available functions and scripts that we have at our disposal. It just kind of gives a little bit more context to things going on inside of the. It gives them more context to things going on inside of the code. The package.json is a super important file, and we're going to spend more time talking about it over time. But remember, when we first started working with Node, we talked about how Node files are, how Node projects are able to use various packages inside of them. So the package.json manages those packages that we're using as dependencies. It also defines out some of the scripts that we can use inside of our application. So remember, we ran that command npm start. That's the script that's defined here. All of the scripts that you run with React are described in this script section. You can also create your own script and give it its own name and give it its own command to run inside of the terminal, which we'll play around with over time as well. But most importantly, we just use this npm start, which used the React scripts function to start our project using React. The .git ignore is a file that's created for Git projects to like kind of make sure that you ignore large files that are unnecessary to save into your version control. And so this is just a file that they started for us to help us kind of make sure we're not consistently adding larger files that are not necessary into our version control using Git and GitHub. Yeah, that's kind of a basic walkthrough of all the files there, homies. With the app.js, this is the real main place where we do a lot of the work of defining out all of our components and stuff like that, and like kind of the things going on. The app.css is in all, we would normally define out different components and different files, which we'll talk about later. But here we see our first big component, the app.js, and that's all in the source folder. Inside of the public folder, the most important thing to know is that that's where our index.html file is. That ends up being our main kind of website file. And the last couple of stuff I wanted to show you was if you inspect this page, right? So if you use the Chrome developer tools and you inspect this page, you're going to see a couple different elements, right? This HTML elements that are coming up are the exact same things that are inside of our index.html file, right? The head with all that metadata, the body, here's that no script tag that we saw before. And then we see this div called root that was previously empty. But now that we just did the npm start to run this application, we can see inside of here, there's some div with the class of app. And inside of that div with the class of app, there's another thing with a header. And then inside of here are all of the elements, right? The image, the paragraph, the anchor, all of those elements, right? And those elements are literally the JSX elements that we defined inside of our component. So what React is doing, to our knowledge right now, is taking our components, taking these elements, rendering them on what's called the React DOM, which we're going to need to talk about more, and then using some JavaScript DOM manipulation functions to add that same React node, that thing that it's rendering, into our index.html file inside of this div, which is exactly what you see once you open up all of these elements inside of here. So a lot of complicated stuff going on with that DOM manipulation stuff that we were talking about the other day, right? When we were doing tic-tac-toe, but React is doing a lot of it out of the box for us, especially with those integrated tool chains. And yeah, the last thing that I wanted to talk about was just kind of like a pro tip for those of y'all who are getting started with React for the first time. Inside of your, so whenever you start React, you're gonna end up using a terminal to run it, which is important to know. In order to stop running it, you're gonna have to go to your terminal that's running it like this, wherever it says something like this, and you're gonna type control, you're gonna hold control, and you're gonna press C to stop it, to stop running whatever's running. When your app's not running, if you were to refresh the page, it's gonna tell you that it can't find the React app anymore, right? I can't reach localhost 3000. There's no server that's running this, right? You're gonna always need to make sure you go back to your app and run that command npm start to make sure that your application runs as you would expect it to run, right? And when it runs, it's gonna rebuild and then like relaunch the server. But the thing I wanted to talk about was outside of the server, right? I don't really need the server up right now. Once you're outside of the server, so you can stop the running server and then go back to your main directory, right? One thing that you can do right now, if you have Git installed on your computer, this is only going to work if you have Git installed on your computer. So if you don't have Git installed on your computer, if you go to your terminal and you type git -- version and you don't see some version of Git on your computer, you're going to want to go to, I think it's git scm. I forgot what the website is. Git-scm.com, which is the place you go to download Git, right? So you could also just type in download Git in Google, and you'll see the Git website. Inside of here, it'll give you a version that you can download for your particular computer. You should make sure you download it because Git is a very important tool for developers who are looking to make sure that they're saving different versions of their code at different moments in time. We're going to be using Git a lot in all of the coursework we're doing, but it's also just a super important tool that ties very well to another tool that you're going to end up using a whole lot as a developer, which is called GitHub. And GitHub is basically just a website that allows you to take any project that is using Git, which is Git is its own tool, right? You can use any project that's using this tool called Git, can use this website called GitHub in order to save code online in the cloud, basically. Like you could save the code that you have online. So I'm gonna just sign into GitHub real quick and just show you this one cool thing about React that is the Create React App tool chain that is really dope to know. So once I log into GitHub, right, I'm not gonna kind of belabor this point because I could talk about this for a while in a different video. But the idea here is that say I was done with say I'm starting a new React project, right? I just did the npx create React app with my new project, right? That thing went through, did that big script. Now I have a new project at this folder. I change into the folder, right? And now inside of this folder, right, I see all my files. I can run this command. If I have Git installed on my computer, I can run this command git status. And what you'll see is I'm branch master, changes not staged for commit. There's a Git project in here. So remember, one of the things we pointed out in the installation of Create React App was that it initialized a Git repository for us, which is so cool because what that means is that we already have this project connected to Git. A lot of people get confused about this later when they start trying to put their project to GitHub. Well, you already have one of the two steps you need for your project to be pushed to GitHub already taken care of for you. Create React App, not only does it create a Git repository for you, which allows you to check the status and see that you're on a branch and see all these changes. If you do the command git log, you'll see that there's also already been one commit that was made for you. When the Create React App finished, it created a commit that says initialize project using Create React App. So something that's really dope is that Create React App toolchain automatically gave you a Git project inside of your folder. It already gave you your first commit. And if you make a change, like I made a change to the app.js, right? All I need to do now is to add the change that I made, right? I can add this new change. I just use the get add star method to add the change, right? And I can commit it again. I could say change text in app.js, right? So I use the get commit method, and I'll do a whole nother set of lessons on Git. This is just to show you that what you can do. So now that I've made this commit, and if I do git log again, I'll see 2 commits because I just made one called change text in app.js, right? I have Git in here. So if I wanted to connect this project to GitHub, all I would have to do is go to GitHub, go to new repository, click create a new repository. And inside of this new repository, I could call the repository whatever I want, you know. So for right now, I'm gonna just say testing React. I would say let's testing React config, because React configured some stuff for us, and let's just test out what goes on in there. I can, you know, create a new repository and say, hey, this project is testing the connection between React, Git, and Git, right? I don't need to initialize this with anything because Create React App already gave me a README. It already gave me a .git ignore, and it already did this thing for my license. So I don't even need to click any of these things. I can just click Create Repository. And now I have a new project on GitHub, which is waiting for me to connect it to a specific repository. So I don't need to create a new repository. GitHub already, Create React App already did that. I can literally just push an existing repo from the command line using Create React App because it just did that for me. So I could take this first command that basically tells Git, hey, add this website GitHub as an origin for my code to be pushed to. Then it changes some names of the branches and then it pushes it for me. So if I take this first line, I can go back to the terminal for inside of my new Create React App project. I can paste this line in here, which basically connects my local project to GitHub, right? It gives me a new connected point to GitHub automatic, like just off this one line. I can do this command git branch -m, which just changes the name of the name of the main branch into main. And I can take this last line to push, and voila! Once I refresh, I have my whole new React app that I just created is already up on GitHub, right? And all I had to do is just follow those last 3 commands and not do anything extra, because Create React App automatically created a commit and a repo and all of that for me inside of itself. So I wanted to show you that as just kind of like a dope little perk of like what Create React App does and why it's a really cool tool chain. And for those of y'all who use Git and GitHub pretty consistently, this is probably pretty cool for you. So you know that, oh, I don't have to do a lot of stuff because Create React App does it for me. Yeah, it makes it very simple. And that's one of the purposes of a tool chain. And so, so yeah, congratulations. This was like a good first dive into React. We talked about the Create React app. We talked about React and used the React JS website. We talked about some of the docs. Next time we come back, we're going to talk a lot more specifically about these main concepts in the docs. So everything from Hello World down to thinking in React. We're going to go through these kind of, you know, topic by topic. And then we're going to talk about some more topics related to like things like functional components versus class components, hooks, those types of things. We're going to talk a little bit about testing and all of these big topics that kind of factor into React. We also talked about the Create React App tool chain and how you can use the Create React App tool chain to start a new project and how that works. And when you start a project, how it launches a new local host server for you to use to see your project change over time. And also how the Create React App tool chain has some really cool built-in features for working in development, but also, you know, getting ready for production. And then lastly, we talked about all of the different files that kind of get started, that kind of get defined in your React project when you first started. There's a lot more to say and a lot more to do, but we're going to talk about those in later videos. So for now, I want y'all to, yeah, pat yourselves on the back. You did a great job, and let's keep rocking and talking about more JavaScript Jawns together in the future. So thank y'all for tuning in, and thank y'all for those of y'all who watch this later. I hope this was helpful. And yeah, we'll talk a lot more about this stuff soon. So peace.